On May 2nd, the Trump administration released its plan to lessen offshore drilling safety regulation that was put in place under the Obama administration after the Deepwater Horizon spill. Interior Secretary David Bernhardt, a former oil lobbyist who was confirmed by the Senate last month to head the agency that oversees the nation's public lands and waters, delivered the news in Port Fourchon, Louisiana. The Trump administration's bill contains a significant reduction in the requirement for oil companies to test fail-safe devices called blowout preventers, which are intended to be a last line of defense against disasters like Deepwater Horizon. It is calculated that lessening in safety regulation will save the offshore oil industry $824 million over a 10-year period. This doesn't take us back to before the Obama rules, said Chris Eaton, an attorney with the group Earth Justice, but still allows another Deepwater Horizon to happen. More than a year before, on January 4, 2018, the Trump administration released its 5-year plan for offshore oil drilling starting in 2019, which would expand offshore drilling to more than 90% of waters in the Atlantic, Pacific, Gulf of Mexico, and Arctic. Since about 195 million gallons of gas are lost into our oceans yearly from oil extraction, transportation, and consumption, offshore oil drilling in the Arctic could have a disastrous effect on such a pristine and unpolluted environment. This plan would allow the government to auction off permanently protected areas to be used for offshore oil drilling. These recent actions by the Trump administration raise the question, to what extent is the United States government effectively regulating offshore oil drilling in order to do what is best for the people as well as for the environment? Kerr-McGee Corporation was the first company to drill from an offshore fixed platform in 1947, which officially started the offshore drilling industry. Since offshore deposits are usually larger than those found onshore, offshore oil drilling became very appealing, and by the 1950s it became the second greatest generator of money in the United States after taxes. Fast forward a few years and Proclamation 5030 was put into place by President Reagan, asserting that the United States owned the land up to 200 miles away from the coastline, which greatly expanded the amount of oil the United States had access to. In the recent century, offshore oil drilling has continued to expand as advancements in drilling technology, dynamic positioning equipment, and floating production and drilling units have made prospects viable that were previously unreachable. Globally, offshore oil production has accounted for about 30% of total oil production over the past decade, and reached 9.3 million barrels per day in 2015. More recently, the offshore oil drilling industry was thrust into the limelight on April 20, 2010 with the Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf of Mexico, which is recognized as the largest and most destructive oil spill in the United States history. It took 89 days to cap the leak, but not before 3.19 million gallons of oil spilled into the Gulf of Mexico and a 22-long oil plume was created. Some of the effects of the spill on the environment include pelicans black with oil, fish belly up in brown sludge, smothered turtles washed up on beaches. In response, the Obama administration passed stricter regulation on the industry, including requirements for design of well components, as well as monitoring and inspection. BP, the company which owned the Deepwater Horizon rig, agreed to settle out of court and pay more than $20 billion. A judge approved the settlement on April 4, 2016. To understand the recent deregulation of offshore oil drilling and opening of United States coastal waters to drilling, it helps to see in the big picture of President Trump's American energy dominance plan. His administration is working to gain access to more of the natural resources found within the United States so as not to depend on other countries for energy. For example, they have taken away regulations on coal mining, approved a variety of oil pipelines, and opened up the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge to energy exploration. These policies have made the United States the largest producer of crude oil in the world and made the country a net natural gas exporter for the first time since 1957. This shows how the deregulation and expansion of oil drilling is just one of the many ways the Trump administration is leading the United States to energy dominance. Although the current government's lessened regulation of the offshore oil industry benefits the country by increasing employment and making us more energy self-sufficient, it ultimately causes a greater negative effect by putting the lives of workers and people who live near the coast in greater danger and the preservation of the environment at stake. One must acknowledge that increasing offshore oil drilling would benefit the country economically and politically. A report created by the Quest Offshore Consulting Group for the American Petroleum Institute and National Ocean Industries Association shows how if drilling was to be increased in the Atlantic Ocean, a rapid increase in jobs would follow. In this way, the Trump administration's recent deregulation of the offshore oil industry is helping the country, for they're taking steps which would create more jobs and help the economy. Similarly, Interior Secretary Ryan Zink, the man who recently announced the deregulation of offshore oil drilling, remarked to reporters how American energy dominance is good for the economy, the environment, and our national security. Responsibly developing our resources in Alaska especially will allow us to use our energy diplomatically to aid our allies and check our adversaries. That makes America stronger and more influential around the globe. This further supports that the Trump administration's deregulation of the offshore oil industry would help the country, for it would make the United States more independent, increasing the chance that the United States will remain a powerhouse in the future. On the other hand, increasing offshore oil drilling would put the lives of those who live on the coast and oil rig workers in more danger. Congressman Frank Pallone, representing the state of New Jersey, argued to the House of Representatives that the Trump administration's plan to increase offshore oil drilling in the United States will risk the livelihoods of millions on the Atlantic coast and in New Jersey. An oil spill anywhere along the coast would cause severe environmental damage to fisheries, popular beaches, and wildlife, which is why we need to maintain the protections put into place after the Deepwater Horizon spill and put a ban on the expansion of offshore drilling. Beyond ordinary citizens being affected, a national commission on the BP Deepwater Horizon spill and offshore drilling for the President of the United States from 2010 found American offshore oil riggers were way more likely to experience fatalities per 1,000 workers than their European counterparts working on identical equipment. This highlights how American offshore oil drilling safety regulation was not enough in 2010, and with Trump's deregulation bringing the safety standards back down, American offshore oil riggers will once again be put in greater harm. Similarly, increasing offshore oil drilling would have a negative effect by expanding the amount of pollution going into our oceans and near pristine natural environments. When Franz Matzner, director of the Beyond Oil Initiative, Government Affairs Program, and Natural Resources Defense Council, testified before the United States Senate, he strongly advised that to avoid increased rates of asthma attacks and respiratory diseases, degraded air quality, and more frequent, costly, and deadly extreme weather events, we must protect, not drill, the Arctic and Atlantic coasts. Imagine a Deepwater Horizon-sized oil spill in the Arctic, one of the last places on Earth which has not been tampered with by humans. The United States Coast Guard has expressed that it doesn't have the capability to clean up an oil spill in the Arctic, so the government's plan to open the Arctic to drilling would be essentially signing its death wish. The proposed offshore drilling in the Arctic will not be the first time the United States government put the natural environment at risk in Alaska. In 1971, the United States military did nuclear testing underground on the small volcanic island of Amchitka, which lays off western Alaska. A group of environmental activists set out on a small sailing ship from Vancouver, headed to Amchitka to protest the nuclear testing. The island was prone to earthquakes, and the activists feared the underground explosion, the third such nuclear testing on the island, would trigger devastating earthquakes and tsunamis. The island was also the last refuge for 3,000 endangered sea otters and home to bald eagles, peregrine falcons, and other wildlife. Although the activists were intercepted by the U.S. Navy and the nuclear testing still took place, it was ultimately a victory since media attention was brought to the topic and nuclear testing on Amchitka would end that year. The small group of activists on the sailboat would go on to start the international environmental nonprofit Greenpeace. One of the big differences, however, between the two events is that nuclear testing only faced opposition from grassroots activists, while with the Arctic offshore oil drilling opposition comes from politicians and large environmental nonprofits. The Trump administration's plan to expand offshore oil drilling has been met with serious backlash from a wide variety of groups. Since the announcement, governors from both parties in 17 coastal states have announced their opposition to drilling for oil off their shores. Furthermore, 37 senators have written together to the Secretary of Interior to express their strong disagreement with the legislation and demand the law be changed. Finally, countless environmental groups and nonprofits are working to change things on a smaller scale. The future is not certain, but the possibility of wide-scale offshore oil drilling in U.S. coastal waters in the Arctic is looking slim as politicians from both sides of the spectrum are working together to prohibit it, and the number of people who seek to preserve the environment and combat global warming continues to grow. If you want to keep our coastal waters offshore oil rig free, you can sign one of the countless petitions found online or contact your local political representative and urge them to say no to offshore oil drilling.